Okay, hi everyone. So we are into, oh my goodness, I'm gonna put our frame up on the window here. Week 6 already, which I sort of can't believe. I want these introduction notes to kind of get you into the materials that we're going to be looking at for this week. You can find them on our page and click on the directions. So, like I said, we're into week 6. All of our speeches will be finished in class on Wednesday, and we'll make sure we get through everyone's. We have an article that we're going to respond to that I'll show you in a second this week. Notice you can take a little bit more time with your responses, especially with these articles. I don't mind the extra day. When we get together in class, I'll share our next assignment, what we're going to be working on, and there'll be a short question survey for this week to finish up. So aside from that, we're also going to be looking at our They Say I Say packet, and I'll have a couple notes to help you get started on that. For this week, there is an article that we're going to be reading from The Atlantic. And most especially, I want to preface this a little bit. This is a piece, Blackface Was Never Harmless. In 1896, the Atlantic writer remembered darkening his face with burnt cork and acting out exaggerated caricatures of blackness with little reflection on the actual racial oppression and violence around him. I thought we could read this particularly because I mentioned last week we're going to be talking about for the next few weeks varying different forms of identity as related to what happens in culture today. For the first big part of our class, we talked a lot about consumerism and advertising, which is a really big part of obviously, of our mainstream culture. However, I really want to get into some of the nitty gritty and harder, I think, to talk about topics, but ones that I believe hold so much important relevance today as much as they did back then. This article is inspired republication because you've probably seen in the news and or heard this is the link to the piece where Virginia Governor Ralph Northam has refused to resign. He was pictured or allegedly pictured as being in blackface in one of his yearbooks. And he said at that moment that wasn't him, but he did admit to wearing blackface another time. He is not the only one that has come under allegations for this, obviously, but this is an area that I want to talk a little bit more about, and this article does a good job of kind of getting into it. And so I know we'll all come with varying different opinions and ideas. So I just ask that as we go through some of these topics, that you be mindful and aware of each other and just kind of looking at what we can each bring to this. I'm inspired to think about. I love the idea of thinking about identity. Where do we actually discover ourselves in pop culture? I find that there should be a divide, in my opinion, between private and public because we ourselves, our personality, that's sort of like our individuality. Um, we are who we are, but very much who we are is shaped socially, publicly, politically, and so many religiously, in so many different forms. When we're asked to identify ourselves on like forms, we have to identify gender and race. Sometimes we identify ourselves with ethnic or religious or national heritage. And so that becomes also part of the ways that we sort of identify ourselves mainstreamly and we kind of quote unquote put ourselves into different categories. And that's not necessarily bad. It's just interesting to think how we categorize ourselves in that way. I think this is a long time struggle that we in the United States have kind of had sort of how do we sort of come together between the fact that we have our own personal identities, but then we also have this sort of national identity and a social identity. So it comes up with a lot of different constraints. I think we've always, this country has always struggled with racial assimilation, with war in such different, capacities. We've dealt with into sort of a post-racial presidency because President Obama obviously was our first African American president. So a lot of the discussions of identity go far beyond just race and ethnicity and nationality because identity really starts to talk about the status of us. We can talk about areas like feminism, we can talk about sexuality, we can talk about these topics that should be much more in the open today. That's really why I want to share this article with you because I think these topics are so important and such relevance, and this is just one article we're going to be looking at. um, Obviously our identity is bound to, what's going on in culture today, what's going on in pop culture today. It's absolutely bound and constrained by our technologies that we have as well. How we affiliate ourselves, we think about our favorite brands. So I think that's also really important to kind of keep in mind and consider. And that's not to say, we are so, dare I say, hyper connected all the time. We have so many different platforms, both virtual and non-virtual platforms that we put ourselves on. So we might say that we have our identities can have so many different types of meanings and context. You can have, and say maybe you have a couple different identities in some sort of way. So I want the readings that we look at for this unit to be ones that we can talk about different gender roles, identities, racial sort of implications, boundaries that come up with that. Mental health issues, I think, are a really important part of identity today and how kind of we relate to that too. And as you read as well, think about, especially as you get into this article, what are some of the implications? What are some of those ideas, the stereotypes that kind of come up? How do you think identity is sort of being framed in the context here? And how exactly culture does or does not dictate maybe some of the ways that we act or what we find funny, what we find interesting too. So it's definitely, like I said, there's some interesting history to read back in this piece. And I'll provide some other context. There's a couple other articles linked in here. I would suggest referencing them when we're going through for discussion this week too. But I think it's really interesting to start here in terms of talking about very much in sort of talking about the sides of what's going on in terms of forming identities along the way. I'm very interested. Yes, you can read the comments if you really want to, but I don't always suggest you read the comments on here. And I think I really want your opinions very much so on this idea of, what are we forming these bases and identities today? Definitely read through if you haven't read or watched any of the footage of sort of what re-sparked some of this again. I think it'll be really, helpful for you to have some of the context behind it. You can watch some of the clips that are on here. I'll make sure to repost this part as well, which just comes right from the beginning of the article that you see here too. I was really interested. I keep thinking of these questions. Where do we discover ourselves in pop culture? Just a quick search for me found that there are so many different representations that we can look at in terms of looking at the way we, feel that culture is either helping or hindering us from understanding each other and understanding ourselves. I found a lot of pieces on the gender roles, different gender positions that we can also look at. I also thought this particular one was very interesting, and perhaps we'll read this in a different week. The Year We Obsess Over Identity, and that was written in 2015. But I thought that's a great word to sort of connect with this, is what is our obsession with identity? And I think, something, of course, to think about. It was interesting to see some of the relevant search terms that came up to my question. The importance of pop culture. I would love if we could focus more on the positive influences of pop culture. But I think in terms of looking and structuring and talking about identity, I'm not sure how many positives sort of come out of that. And I think that's really interesting to kind of look at. I thought this is a great book if you haven't read it. Everything Bad is Good for You, How Today's Pop Culture is Actually Making Us Smarter. So that's Steven Johnson. That's a really good book to sort of look at and refer. But I think for us to start off conversations on identity, I think that we need to sort of figure out where can lines be drawn and where can we find sort of meaning and interaction beyond that, especially in how we treat one another, what's sort of dictated by, what we're dictating ourselves, and then how we're also sometimes letting what happens in pop culture dictate this too. I hope we can take some time and also look in terms of varying different identity forms. I have a really good article on pop culture's transgender moment. I think that that's a really important piece that we kind of want to look at and consider as well. And I'll probably bring a couple of one of these articles to class too, but I definitely want to start you off with this one in hopes that maybe you can find some conversation and some ideals to sort of talk about. So that's what we'll be looking at this week. If you have any questions, please let me know. I look forward to finishing our speeches and hearing your conversation. Please keep up and make sure to check back for all other different types of material that come up.